This is section 3.5, and we are looking at really focusing on graphing the function, identifying the domain and range, and now interpreting the slope and the intercepts. So this section in particular is the first time we're interpreting slope. So this is likely to show up as something like this as a quiz question. So let's start. The first part says, a submersible that is exploring the ocean floor begins to ascend to the surface. The elevation h in feet of the submersible is modeled by the function the h of t equals 650t minus 13,000, where t is time in minutes. So let's first talk about t is time in minutes. Right? And we have the h of t, or the h, really, the h of t represents the elevation, or the height. Sorry. Okay? So, the first thing it wants us to do is to graph the function. So I'm going to make myself an x and y axis. Now, I want you to think about this graph. In this situation, I'm not necessarily going to show all four quadrants because I know my time has to be positive and my elevation is going from, since we're at 13, where it says there's it's at negative 13,000 feet, I'm going down in the ocean. We're starting down below sea level. So I'm going to make my graph kind of look like the fourth quadrant. All right. And so we're going to call this our time, because it's the x-axis. And this is our y-axis. This is time. And this would be, let's go to our elevation. I'm going to move that over a little bit. We'll call this elevation. Okay? Where this is at zero elevation and everything below it is below sea level. So the first thing it's asking us to do is to graph it. Now, I could start rising and find my m and my b and rise over run to my points, use the y-intercept. But these look like kind of big numbers, so I'm going to go with my x and y intercepts because it's asking me to interpret my intercepts anyways. I'm going to have to find them. So to find the x-intercept, right, we have to find the x-intercept, I have to set y equal to 0. So the equation is the h of t equals 650t minus 13,000. And so I'm going to substitute in 0 for the y, which is the h of t, equals 650t minus 13,000. Oops, I add an extra 0. And then I'm going to add 13,000. And we're left with 13,000 equals 650t. Divide both sides by 650. And we get t is equal to 20. So what does that mean, t equals 20? I want you to put that into an ordered pair. So we said that y equals 0. So that means that ordered pair is when t is like your x, right? It's our input. And so when t is 0, when t is 20, our y is 0. We used a 0, remember? Okay, that is my x-intercept. Okay, then we're going to find our y-intercept. And here I have to set x equals to 0. Right? So we're going to do the h of 0, right? Whenever I make my h, right? Equals 650 times t, which is 0. And then I have my minus 13,000. So I've got the h of 0, when x is 0, the elevation will be negative 13,000. So my ordered pair here for the y-intercept would be when x is 0, my y is negative 13,000 feet. So in order to graph that, all I need to really do is graph these 2 points and we are done. So I now know that my x-axis has to go at least up to 20. So I'm going to make each line worth 2. Let's see, 2, 4. And then I'll get 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. And my x-axis has to go to 13,000. So I'm going to make each line worth 2,000. So I'm going to say negative 4,000, negative 8,000, and the next one will be negative 10,000. Oops. No, negative 12,000. Oops, I'm increasing by 4. 12,000. That should be perfect. So now I plot my points. The x-intercept is 20 across and 0, and the y-intercept is 13,000, negative 13,000. Now I connect my dots. Perfect. Okay, so part 1 says graph the function, now identify the domain and range. So in identifying our domain and range, I'm going to kind of keep alternating colors. So now the domain. What I mean by the domain is what is x allowed to be? And x is really talking about the time. So we know that every one of these points on this line, this is an ordered pair. And so where am I picking up my x's from? What would be my minimum value? In this case, my minimum value starts at 0. And so we say 0 is the lowest possible value for an x, right? Because we go from 0, negative 13,000, and it is less than or equal to, we use x for our domain, which is less than or equal to, and we go all the way up to a 20. So any of these points can use any number between x, between 0 and 20. Does that make sense? We're picking any of those numbers, not before and not after. All right, so then I would go to my range, and what are the possibilities for our range, our elevation? Well, the minimum elevation would be 0, would be less than or equal to, and then when we talk about range, we use y, which is less than or equal to, and you know what? I'm doing this backwards. Let's start again. The lowest possible elevation would be negative 13,000, would be less than or equal to y, which is less than or equal to 0. We always start with the lower number. So now I've done everything I need to in letter A. The next part it says is interpret the slope and the intercepts of the graph. So let's start with the intercepts because we've already found them. I'm going to erase this and make it a little clearer. This is negative 13,000. All right, so now we are, the first thing you have to do when you interpret the X and Y intercepts is you have to identify. And it's always going to be the same protocol. The X intercept is, and then you tell me what it is. And so in this case, the X intercept is 20, 0, period. And now you have to explain it. What does 20 mean? What does Y mean in the context of the story? This means, you say this means, what does 20 represent? Since it's on the timeline, that means 20 minutes. And what does the 0 mean? 0 means it will be at 0 elevation. So we would say this means in 20 minutes, the submersible, the submarine, will ascend. Let's use the language of the problem. Will ascend to sea level, to 0 or sea level. All right. So that is how we interpret our intercept. Now we're going to use the same language, except we're going to do the Y-intercept, okay? The Y-intercept, first you have to identify, is, we have to label it, 0, 13,000, negative 13,000. Okay, this means, no, I didn't, that doesn't look like means. This means let's see, let's go. 0 stands for the X, and my Y-intercept is at negative 13,000. So 0 minutes, what does that mean, 0 minutes? That's the starting time. The submarine, or the submersible, begins, instead of saying 0 minutes, at, that implies, the 0 minutes implies that it's the beginning, at 13,000 feet. In fact, I'm going to get rid of the negative, and I'm going to say 13,000 feet below sea level. All right. So this is the protocol that we're always using. We identify first, the Y-intercept is, and then we use the this means, and you explain it. All right, so now we have identified our intercepts. That's right here. There's a lot being asked here. I now have to identify the slope, interpret the slope. It's not saying identify the slope, but you can't really start talking about it without saying what it is. So we could do a rise over run to find our slope, but they've given us the equation. And in the equation, we have our m. It's right there. So in the equation, it is, let's go, y, no, it's the h of t equals 650 t minus 13,000. All right, so my m, actually, they've already kind of given it to us. It's right there next to the t. My m is 650. Right away, I want you to turn that into a fraction. The only way we can turn that into a fraction is to put it over 1. So now I want to take it back and do a little bit of work, remind you of some work we did. Remember we talked about slope is equal to y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1, right? Another way to put that is, aren't we finding the change in y over the change in x? Now what I want you to do is look at your graph and tell me notice the numerator is the change in y. So what topic is really introduced on the y-axis? That's elevation. And what topic is actually in the x-axis? That is time in minutes. Does that make sense? So now let's interpret. Now we interpret our slope. Take it to the story, elevation per minute. Okay, so we would say, since this is positive, it's ascending, it's rising, it's increasing. So now we are going to talk about the slope. We have to identify it is 650 over 1. This means, same thing, same protocol. The sub ascends, increases, rises, because it's positive. 650 feet per minute. There we have it. Now we have identified the slope and we have interpreted the slope. This means. So let's go back to our problem and make sure we've done everything. I'm going to kind of like section this off. The first thing we did, it asked us to graph the function and identify the domain and range. We've done that. I graphed it using the intercepts. Remember that? Found the 2 points. I created the graph. Next thing I did was I identified the domain and range. Check. Done. Next, we interpret the slope and intercepts of the graph. First, we identified and interpreted the slopes, the intercepts, then we interpreted. First, we identified the x-intercept, then we interpreted. First, we identified the y-intercept, then we interpreted. Next, we found the slope, our last part right here. I've done the intercepts. And we know the slope in y equals mx plus b. It comes right before the input. That's our slope. We turned it into a fraction. We related the numerator to the y-axis topic, elevation, the denominator to the x-axis topic, time, and then we explained in words. The slope is 650. First we identify, then we explain. This means the sub ascends 650 feet per minute. Now, if that doesn't make sense, then you explain in the context of the problem. Right? If the x and y intercepts don't make sense, then you explain in the context of the problem. But you have to be able to explain the, so you have to be able to relate the topics of the graph to the slope. And that is interpreting intercepts and slope.